Hi, today I'm going to talk about mood in English grammar. There are basically three types of mood. The first one is indicative, the second one is imperative, and the third one is subjunctive. This is Kamran Ali, and I can be contacted at kamranali.asal@gmail.com. You can also contact me through my WhatsApp number, and that is 092 021 0345 2247 160. Let's begin. All right. What is mood? Mood refers to expressing feelings or displaying the attitude. English speakers, they express their feelings or display their attitude in three ways. The first one is indicative, the second one is imperative, and the third one is subjunctive. Now, what is indicative mood? The indicative mood states a fact, opinion, or question. As speakers, we all present facts, share opinions, or ask questions. Now, if you look at these three sentences, we can see that the first one, I have a big house, is presenting a fact about the subject I. Here, the subject I is telling us that he has got a big house. Whereas in the second sentence, I believe he is from America, the subject I is expressing his opinion about someone. In the third sentence, we can see that a question is being asked. Now, this means whenever we are presenting facts, sharing opinions, or asking questions, we are making use of indicative mood. Now, why do we need to learn about indicative mood? This you would only understand when you learn about the two more types. So let's see what is the second type. The second type of the mood is imperative mood. The imperative mood refers to order or command someone. Now this means we not only present facts, share opinions, or ask questions, we also order or command people. Now, the language we use to command people is different from the language we use to present facts, share opinion, or ask questions. And that's why we have got another mood in English grammar, which is called imperative mood. Now, imperative mood is not only different from indicative mood in terms of its use or function, its structure is also different from the indicative mood. Let's have a look at some examples here. Stand up. Now here we can see that the first form of a verb is being used, and we don't see any subject. Whereas in indicative mood, we can use all forms of verbs, present, past, past participle. But we cannot use past form in imperative mood. Or we cannot use past participle form in the imperative mood. So this means the structure of the imperative mood is different than the indicative mood. So when we got to order someone, or command someone, we are bound to use imperative mood. We cannot use indicative mood. And that's why we really need to learn about that. Another thing which we can note over here, that the subject is being omitted in all these three sentences. Now this means we don't need to use the subject in the imperative mood, because quite often it is implied or understood in the context. For example, when you say stand up to someone, he or she understands that he or she is being instructed. So you don't need to say you stand up, because the one you're talking to, it's understood that person is being instructed. So you can omit the subject you, because without using the subject you, in this case, the listener can understand that he or she is being instructed. Same goes for the rest of two sentences. Get me a glass of water. You don't need to tell that you get me a glass of water when you're talking to the speaker, and it can be determined in the context that he or she is being ordered or commanded. Now let's have a look at the third type, and that is called subjunctive mood. When we have to talk about actions or states that are in doubt or not factual, we can use the subjunctive mood. Now there are two types: present subjunctive and past subjunctive. Now let me discuss the indicative mood once again, to make you understand how the subjunctive mood is different from the indicative mood. We use the indicative mood to express opinions, to present facts, or to ask questions. Now, when we are talking about things which are imaginary, things which are hypothetical, which we just suppose, and which don't exist, and which are not factual, we cannot use the indicative mood. We got to use the subjunctive mood, and that's why we really need to learn about it. Now, before I go ahead with some examples about the subjunctive mood, I would like you guys to see what is the present subjunctive. The present subjunctive is formed using first or base form of the verb. Now, what is the base form of the verb? The verb go has got three forms. The first form is go. The past form, or the second form, is went. A past participle form, or the third form, is gone. Now, when we are using the subjunctive mood, we got to make use of the first form of the verb go. We're not going to use, in case of present subjunctive, we are not going to use the past form of the verb or the past participle form of the verb. Moreover, the present subjunctive takes words of suggestions, demands, requests. The words of suggestions include the words like recommend, suggest, advisable, important. The words of demands include the words like demand, require. The words of requests include the words like request, ask, prefer. Now this means if we want to identify whether a particular sentence is in the subjunctive mood or not, we got to look for the words of suggestions, the words of demands, the words of requests. We also need to determine whether the present form of the verb is being used or not. Now let's have a look at some examples for the better understanding. If you look at the first example, it says, the doctor recommended that she stay home to have some rest. Now here we can see that in the main clause, in the first clause, the word of suggestion is being used, and that is recommended. This one. Whereas in the second clause, which we also call that clause or a dependent clause, we can see the first form of verb is being used. Now these two things suggest that this sentence is in the subjunctive mood because it has got the word of suggestion. It has also got the first form of verb in the dependent clause. Another thing which we really need to understand, that the sentences in the subjunctive mood are comprised of two clauses. The doctor recommended is the main clause because here the doctor is the subject and recommended is the verb. That she stay home to have some rest is another clause because it's beginning with a subordinator, and that is called that, and it has got a subject, so it is another clause and it cannot stand its own, so it is depending on the first clause, which is the main clause. So this means we got to see three things if we want to identify whether a sentence is in the subjunctive mood or not. The first thing, that it should be comprised of two clauses, one independent, another dependent. The second thing, that the main clause should have the word of suggestions. As I showed you in the previous slides, the words like recommend, the words like advisable, important, such words are to be in the main clause, or the words of demands. For example, the word like demand, the word like require, or the words of requests. For example, the word like urge, the word like request itself. All right, so if you have such words in the main clause, then the chances are the sentence is in the subjunctive mood. Another important thing we need to understand, that the second clause, the dependent clause, should have a verb in the base form. And we can see over here that stay is a base form of the verb. It's the first form of the verb. All right. Now, another important thing which you really need to understand about the subjunctive mode, that it doesn't follow the subject verb agreement rules. For example, if you're writing a sentence in the indicative mode, we can write this way: he goes to school. All right. Now here we can see he is the third person pronoun and he is the singular pronoun. So with the third person singular pronoun, what we do when we have an action verb, we add s or es to that verb. So he goes to school. She sings a song. Right? So he is the third person pronoun, she is the third person pronoun, and we can see when we are using the first form of the verb, we add s or es to those verbs. Whereas we can clearly see in case of the subjunct, in case the sentence is in the subjunctive mood, we don't have s or es in the base form of the verb. That means we do not add s to it, s or es to it. So here we can say the sentence says or the clause says she stays instead of she stays. So we don't use the normal rules of the subject verb agreement when we are writing a sentence in the subjunctive mood. So there are three things about the subjunctive mode. Sentence is comprised of two clauses, main and dependent. Main clause has the word of suggestion or the word of demand or the word of the main clause has the word of a suggestion or the word of a demand or the word of a request. And the third thing which we really need to keep in mind that in the dependent clause, we need to have the verb in the present form without following the normal, usual rules for the verb subject agreement. Now, if you keep all these things in mind, you can easily identify a sentence in the subjunctive mode. Now, let me erase it. All right. Another important thing which you really need to understand that if we want to talk about past, we are just going to change the verb in the main clause into the past form. For example, over here we can say the doctor recommended. Now this recommended is the past form. Whereas the verb in the that clause or dependent clause would remain in the present form, would never be changed into the past form. So this means, and that's why this is called present subjunctive, because the verb in the dependent clause is not changed into the past form at all. So if we want to indicate the past time, you got to change the form of the verb in the main clause as it's been done here. Instead of recommend, it says the doctor recommended because this happened in the past. Whereas the verb in the that clause or dependent clause remains the same, remains in the present form. It is not changed. Now let's have a look at another example here. The boss recommends that I come on time from tomorrow. Now here we can see that this is something which is about the present time. Why? Because the main clause, the verb in the main clause is in the present form. If I change this verb into past, let's suppose if I write over here, the boss recommended, this would mean that this action happened in the past. But I would not change the verb in the dependent clause. In other words, the verb come would remain in the same form. It would not become came. All right, another thing which is what talking that we also can have adjectives in the dependent clause. But when we are going to have an adjective in the dependent clause, we got to write be before the adjective. For example, here she insisted that I be nice to her. Now here in this sentence, we can see in the that clause, in the dependent clause, we can see we have an adjective here, and that is nice. But before this, we got to add be. So whenever your dependent clause in the subjunctive mood has an adjective, you must add be before it. This rule is not applied when we have a verb in the that clause. It is only applied when we have an adjective in the that clause. All right, let's go ahead now. I would like you to pay attention this particular sentence where we are making use of negation. Her mom suggested that she not play tomorrow night. Now, when we are writing the clause which indicates negation, we don't have to use do or does with the third form, with the third person pronoun. Had this sentence been in the indicative mood, it would have been written this way. Her mom suggested, no, her mom said she doesn't play. Okay, her mom says or her mom said she doesn't play. Now, in this case, I'm using does not because the sentence is the sentence is in indicative mood or in the indicative mood. But in case of the subjunctive mood, we're not going to have do or does after the subject. So we would omit do or does and we would simply say she not play, I not play, they not play. We're not going to have do or does. Now this also indicates that this sentence is in the subjunctive mood. Because normally when we negate or we write negative sentences in the indicative mood, we say she doesn't work, she doesn't listen. So we use do or does. And that is not done when we are writing the sentence in the subjunctive mood. Now let's talk about the past subjunctive. The past subjunctive is actually formed using the past form of a verb, and it is used to talk about hypothetical or imaginary situations, the situations which are not factual. Let's have a look at some examples. Before I go ahead with examples, I would like you guys to pay attention to these words because they are normally used in past subjunctive mood or in the sentences in the past subjunctive mood. If only, wish, suppose, as though. Now, this means whenever you see these words, you got to understand that the particular sentence is in the past subjunctive mood. So these are the indicators of the past subjunctive mood. I wish I were a king. Now here, once again, we can see there are two clauses. I wish I were. One subject is I, another subject is I, so there are two clauses. We can see a verb here, we can see a verb here also. A verb, a subject, a subject. So that means this sentence is comprised of two clauses. Now here, when we talk about the meaning of this sentence, we can say that this is something which is not possible. I wish I were a king. I cannot be, and I am not. But this is something I would like to imagine, right? So whenever you want to talk about your imagination, the things which are not possible, but you would like to suggest that if those things happen, right? you actually make use of the past subjunctive mood. So I wish I were a king suggests that the person cannot be the king. And this is his desire, which cannot be fulfilled, which is not possible. Right? So that's why the subjunctive, past subjunctive mood is being used here, because the past subjunctive mood talks about imaginary situations or indicates the imaginary situations. Let's have a look at another example. If only I had wings, I would fly to Paris. So this means that's not possible to have wings, to have wings. So that's why the speaker is using the past subjunctive, because this is something not possible. This is something he can't do. He's just imagining, or he's asking us to imagine it. All right? Now, how this is being done, how this past subjunctive mood is being formed, we can see over here that the past form of the verb is being used in the second clause, right? In the second clause, the past form of the verb is being used, and once again, the regular rules for subject-verb agreement are being violated. Let me give you an example here. Normally, we say, I was going to school. If we are writing our sentence in the indicative mood, with I, we use the verb was. So we use a singular verb. We don't use a plural verb. So I was, she was, oh sorry, he was, she was, they were. This is how we write sentences, right? Okay, or sentences, right? In the indicative mood. In case of the subjunctive mood, or especially the past subjunctive mood, we violate this rule. So instead of the singular verb, we write the plural verb, because we want to tell that this is something not possible, and that is being imagined. And let's suppose if we don't do it, it would mean that we are not actually writing the sentence in the subjunctive mood. And if you're not writing the sentence in the subjunctive mood, it's not about something which is imaginary, something which is not possible. So when you're talking about something which is not possible, you have to violate the subject-verb agreement rule. And you have to use the past form of the verb. Let's have a look at one more example here. Let me clear the drawings. All right. Suppose you met Imran Khan. Now here, this word suppose indicates that the subjunctive mood is being used, and the shift in the tense, in the past tense basically, Instead of meet, the writer is using met, and this shift in the past tense tells us that this is something the writer assumes which is not possible, right? So the writer assumes this is something which is not possible. So that's why the writer has used the past form of the verb instead of the present form of the verb. And the writer has used the word suppose because he wants us or the listener to imagine. So he wants to talk about the imaginary situation, right? He wants to talk about the imaginary situation. So that's why he is using the subjunctive mood instead of the indicative mood. All right. She was behaving as though she were a superstar. So why were over here? Why not was? Because the sentence is in the subjunctive mood and it has to violate the normal rule for the subject verb agreement, which says that with third person singular pronoun, we got to use the singular verb. All right. I hope, class, you have understood the use of the present subjunctive mood and the past subjunctive mood. You have also understood how we are going to write a form the past or present subjunctive mood or sentences in the past or present subjunctive mood. Now I have got an assignment for you guys. Write a paragraph about some imaginary situations using wish, if only, as if, as though, and suppose. Try to incorporate your learning into your writing. When you are writing this paragraph, you will definitely learn about the benefit of learning the subjunctive mood. If you still have any question, you can ask me during my online classes, and I will try my level best to help you with this assignment. Thank you very much. Stay home, stay blessed. Have a nice time.